I have spent 31 years of my life on the water, and in all that time, I had never heard fear in Wade Callahan's voice the way I heard it that night. The phone rang at 11:40 in the evening, and I remember the sound of it cutting through the quiet of my kitchen like a blade through canvas. I almost let it go to the machine. I had a long day behind me. My knees ached from hauling traps since before sunrise, and the last thing I wanted was another man's trouble added to my own. But something in me, some old instinct built from years of answering calls that mattered, made me pick it up. "Ray," he said, and his voice cracked on that single syllable. "Ray, I need you out past Widow's Reef. Tonight. Now, if you can." I asked him what in God's name he was talking about, going out to that reef in the dark, in this fog at his age, with his heart the way it was. He didn't answer the question. He just kept saying the same thing over and over, like a man caught in a loop he couldn't escape. "Something's down there, Ray. Something's down there, and it won't let go of my boat." I told him to sit tight, that I'd come, though every part of my better judgment told me this was foolish. Widow's Reef was not a place men went after dark. It never had been, not since before my father's time, and certainly not since my brother Michael vanished somewhere near those waters 11 years ago, leaving nothing behind but an empty boat drifting in slack tide, and a silence that never once let go of me. I dressed in the dark so I wouldn't wake my wife, Carol, and I stood for a moment in the doorway of our bedroom, just listening to her breathe, the way I sometimes do before a long trip, as if some part of me needs to carry that sound with me out onto the water. I did not tell her where I was going. I told myself it was because she was asleep and I didn't want to worry her, but the truth, if I am honest with myself now, is that some deep part of me already knew this trip was different, and I did not want her to see whatever was written on my face. The drive down to the marina took 18 minutes, and I do not believe I said a single word out loud in the truck, though my mind was loud enough for both of us. Widow's Reef. Wade Callahan hadn't set foot near those waters in years, not since his own brush with whatever it was men whispered about down at the Anchor, and Rope, the old bar where retired fishermen gather to drink coffee, laced with something stronger, and tell stories that get taller with each passing winter. I had always dismissed those stories. I told myself the sea takes men in ordinary ways. Storms, engine failure, a rogue wave, a moment's carelessness with a winch cable. I did not believe in the things whispered after midnight. Not until that night. The marina was empty when I arrived, save for the low groan of hulls rocking against their berths and the metallic clink of rigging lines slapping against masts in a wind that had no business blowing as hard as it did. My boat, the Carol Ann, named for my wife the year we married, sat waiting at her slip, patient as she always was, as though she already understood where we were headed and had resigned herself to it. I checked my radar, my running lights, the old radio that still worked despite Carol's insistence I replace it, and I cast off into a night that felt thicker than any fog I had crossed in years. The visibility dropped to almost nothing within the first mile. I have run this coast blind before, trusting instruments over eyes, but there was something different about that fog, something that seemed to swallow the beam of my forward light rather than simply obscure it. I remember thinking, absurdly, that it felt less like weather and more like a held breath. The engine noise sounded muffled, as if the world itself had wrapped cotton around my ears. Even the gulls, which normally cry through the night when disturbed by a passing hull, were silent. I have never in my life experienced a silence so complete on open water, and it settled into my chest like a stone. Wade's voice came through the radio 20 minutes later, thin and static-laced, begging me to hurry, telling me the winch had locked and the boat had stopped answering the wheel, that he was drifting toward the reef and could not correct course no matter what he tried. I told him to cut the engine before he ran himself aground, and for a long moment there was no answer at all, just the hiss of empty airwaves, and my hands went cold on the wheel in a way that had nothing to do with the night air. When his voice came back, it was quieter, almost reverent, the way a man speaks in a church he does not believe in. "Ray," he said, "there's light under the water. I can see it through the hull plating. I swear to God there's light down there." I did not answer him right away. I stood at the wheel with the fog pressing in against the windows of the wheelhouse, my brother's face rising unbidden in my mind, the way it always did when the old grief found a crack to slip through. And for the first time in 11 years, I felt something I had not let myself feel since the day they called off the search for Michael. I felt hope, sharp and unwelcome, twisting itself around the fear in my chest. Whatever was waiting for me out past Widow's Reef, I understood in that moment that I was not simply answering an old friend's call for help. I was steering my boat directly into a mystery that had already taken something from me once before, and some part of me, foolish or brave, I still cannot decide which, wanted to know if the sea was finally ready to give something back. I throttled up, and the Carol Ann pushed forward into the fog, toward the reef, toward whatever waited beneath that impossible glow, and toward a night I would spend the rest of my life trying to fully understand. I found Wade's boat first by sound, before I ever saw it, the low idle of his engine carrying strangely across the water, distorted the way voices sound underwater in a swimming pool, close and far away at the same time. When his running lights finally emerged from the fog, pale and trembling, I felt a small measure of relief loosen the knot in my chest, though it did not last. His boat, the Miss Delilah, sat dead in the water at an angle no vessel should hold in calm seas, tilted just slightly toward the bow, as though something beneath her had a grip on her keel and had no intention of letting go. I brought the Carol Ann alongside carefully, mindful of the reef somewhere beneath us, its jagged teeth known to tear open a hull in seconds if a man misjudged his position by even a few yards. Wade stood at his rail, waiting for me, and even in the poor light, I could see he had aged 10 years since I'd last laid eyes on him at his granddaughter's christening the previous spring. His hand shook as he caught the line I threw across, and when he spoke, his words came out clipped and fast, the way men talk when they are trying very hard not to sound as frightened as they feel. "The winch locked up an hour ago," he said. "I dropped anchor near the reef, same as I always do for the deep drop pots, and something took hold before it ever hit bottom, pulled clean through my hands, burned the rope right off my palms." He held them up to show me, and in the beam of my flashlight, I could see raw red welts crossing both palms, the kind of burn that comes from rope moving fast under tension, not from any ordinary catch of crab pots on a rocky bottom. I told him what I always tell frightened men on the water, which is that the sea has 100 ordinary explanations for things that feel extraordinary in the dark. A drifting net, a sunken container off some cargo ship, a current pulling at an angle that fooled the eye. I said these things because I needed to believe them as much as he did, though even as the words left my mouth, I could hear how thin they sounded against the strange stillness surrounding both our boats. The fog had not lifted. If anything, it pressed closer the longer we sat there, curling around our hulls like something with intention. We worked together to try freeing his anchor line, first by hand, then by rigging a second winch off my own deck, hoping the combined pull might break whatever held it below. Nothing worked. The line simply would not give, not an inch, no matter how much strain we put on it. And twice I felt the deck beneath my boots tremble faintly, a vibration too rhythmic to be current or wave action, more like something enormous breathing slow and steady far beneath us. It was somewhere near 1 in the morning when my instruments began to fail. My depth sounder, which had never once given me trouble in 15 years of ownership, began throwing numbers that made no sense, flashing depths of 6 feet in water I knew to be well over 200, then jumping to readings so deep the display simply blinked and reset itself. My compass needle spun lazily, unmoored from whatever magnetic truth it was built to follow, and even my handheld GPS unit, battery fresh, showed our position drifting wildly across the screen as though we were racing along at 40 knots while sitting dead still. Wade grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise and pointed down past the rail of his boat, and when I followed his gaze, I saw it for the first time. A faint blue-green light pulsing somewhere beneath the black water. Rhythmic, patient, entirely unlike any bioluminescence I had witnessed in 3 decades of night fishing. It did not flicker the way plankton does when disturbed by a hull. It pulsed with intention, slow and even, like something breathing or something waiting to be noticed. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. The fog swallowed even the sound of our own boats idling, and the only thing that seemed real in that suspended silence was the light beneath us, patient and glowing, and the terrible, thrilling certainty settling into my chest that whatever we had stumbled onto out past Widow's Reef that night was about to change both our lives forever, whether we were ready for it or not. I told Wade to bring up his winch controls once more, that I intended to add every ounce of power my own boat could offer to whatever was locked below us, reef or wreck or something else entirely. He looked at me the way a man looks at another man he has fished beside for 30 years, trusting and afraid in equal measure, and he nodded, and together we turned back toward the black water to see what the ocean had decided. After all this time, it was finally ready to give up. The combined winches groaned under a strain I had never asked of my equipment before, metal drums whining in protest as steel cable bit deep into itself, and for nearly 20 minutes, nothing moved at all except the trembling of both our hulls under the pressure of whatever fought us from below. I remember watching the cable go taut as a bowstring, thinking surely it would snap and send a lash of steel whipping across the deck fast enough to kill a man, and I nearly called out to Wade to cut the line before we lost more than just the anchor. Then, all at once, the tension broke, not with a snap, but with a strange giving way, as though whatever held the anchor below had simply decided, on its own terms, to release its grip. The winches surged forward, cable spooling in fast, and both of our boats rocked hard as something massive shifted position beneath the surface, sending a wave rolling out from directly below the reef that lifted our hulls 3 feet and set them back down with a slap that echoed unnaturally loud in the fog-thick air. The light beneath the water grew brighter as whatever it belonged to rose toward the surface, and I remember the way that blue-green glow spread out across the black water like something alive, illuminating the fog itself from within, so that for a moment the entire world around us seemed lit by a color I had no name for, something between the color of deep glacial ice and the color of a healing bruise. Wade began praying out loud beside me, quiet at first, then louder, the words tumbling out of him the way words do from a man who has not spoken to God in years, but suddenly remembers, urgently, that he might need to. What broke the surface first was a curved edge of something metallic, though metallic feels like the wrong word even now as I try to describe it, because the material caught the moonlight breaking briefly through the fog in a way no metal I have ever handled does, refracting light in shifting bands of color across its surface like oil on water, yet clearly solid, clearly built either than grown or formed by any natural process I could name. It rose slowly, water sheeting off in curtains, revealing more of itself with each passing second, a shape unlike any hull or hulk or shipwreck debris I had encountered in a lifetime, spent reading the shapes the sea gives back to men who go looking. It was, I would estimate, some 60 feet across at its widest point, roughly disc-shaped, though not perfectly symmetrical, with one side crushed inward as though it had struck something with tremendous force at some point in its long burial beneath the reef. Barnacles and coral growth clung to portions of its surface in patches, evidence, I understood even in that moment of shock, that this object had rested on the seafloor for a very long time, decades at the least, perhaps far longer, accumulating the slow, patient decoration the ocean gives to anything left still long enough. Wade had stopped praying by then. He simply stood at his rail, with both hands gripping the metal so hard his knuckles had gone white, staring at the thing floating now between our two boats, illuminated by that impossible pulsing light, which seemed to emanate from somewhere within its crushed side, seeping out through cracks and seams like blood finding its way to the surface of skin. Neither of us spoke. I do not know how long we simply stood there, two grown men who had spent our whole lives believing the ocean's mysteries began and ended with storms and fish and the occasional lost soul, staring at proof that the world held far more than either of us had ever prepared ourselves to witness. It was Wade who finally broke the silence, his voice small and strange in the fog. "Ray," he said, "I think we need to bring it in." I remember turning to look at him, at the fear and wonder mixed together on his weathered face, and I remember feeling that same terrible mixture rising in my own chest, along with something else entirely, something I had not expected and could not yet name, a certainty, deep and quiet, that whatever waited inside that crushed and glowing hull was somehow connected to everything I had lost, and everything I still needed to understand, out here on the water that had already taken so much from me and might, at long last, be ready to give something back. I looked at the reef beneath us, at the fog pressing close around both our boats, at the strange light pulsing steady as a heartbeat from the wreckage floating between us, and I made the decision that would change the rest of my life. I told Wade to help me rig lines to bring it alongside my boat, that we would tow it in together, slow and careful, back toward the marina, and whatever answers waited for us there. Neither of us had any idea, in that moment, just how much that decision would cost us both before the truth finally came to light. The tow back toward shore took nearly 4 hours, far longer than the outbound trip, because neither of us dared push our engines past a crawl with that strange vessel lashed alongside the Carol Ann, its crushed hull groaning softly with every swell that passed beneath us, a sound like metal settling, or like something breathing slow and labored in its sleep. I kept glancing over at it through the wheelhouse window, at the pulsing light still visible along the cracks in its side, and I found myself thinking, absurdly, that I was ferrying something wounded home, the way you might carry an injured animal found along the roadside, uncertain whether it would survive the journey or whether you were only prolonging something that had already, in truth, come to its end. Wade followed close behind in the mist, Delilah, and neither of us spoke over the radio during those 4 hours, as if some unspoken agreement had passed between us that words might somehow disturb whatever fragile balance we had found, bringing that thing up from the reef. I remember the fog beginning to thin as we approached shore, the first gray hint of dawn creeping along the eastern horizon, and I remember feeling grateful for that grayness, because it meant the night, at least, the strangest night of my life, was finally coming to its end. We brought both boats into a private cove I knew well, tucked away behind Miller's Point, a place few fishermen bothered with anymore, since the old dock there had fallen into disrepair, and I made the decision, without fully understanding why, that whatever we had found did not belong yet in front of the harbor master, the Coast Guard, or anyone else who might see it, and immediately call in authorities from far beyond our little town. I told myself I only wanted time to understand what we were dealing with before the world descended upon us. Looking back now, I think some part of me already sensed that once the wider world learned what we had pulled from Widow's Reef, my life and Wade's, and everyone connected to us, would never again belong entirely to ourselves. We anchored close to the rocky shore and worked by the gray light of early dawn to inspect the object properly for the first time. Up close, the crushed portion of the hull revealed a jagged opening perhaps 3 feet across, edges curled inward, with a violence that told a story of impact I could only guess at. Some catastrophic collision that had happened long before this thing ever settled onto the reef below. Through that opening, the pulsing light shone steady and strange, and it was there, kneeling at the edge of that broken hull, with seawater still dripping from my sleeves, that I first heard it. A sound, faint but unmistakable, rhythmic. In a way no machine noise ever truly is, a deep, slow thud that repeated every few seconds with the patience of something that had been repeating itself for a very long time, and intended to keep doing so regardless of who was listening. Wade heard it too. I watched the color drain from his face as the sound reached him, and I understood, without either of us saying it aloud, that we were listening to something that lived, or had once lived, or perhaps, impossibly, still lived even now. "That's not an engine," Wade said quietly, and I did not need him to tell me that. I had spent enough years around diesel motors and hydraulic pumps to know the difference between mechanical rhythm and something else entirely, something organic in its irregularity, the kind of sound a chest makes when it rises and falls with breath, or a heart makes when it labors to keep pace with a body barely holding on. I remember the strange vertigo of that realization settling over me, kneeling there on the deck of my own boat in the gray dawn light, understanding that whatever waited inside that crushed hull was not simply cargo or wreckage. It was alive. My mind went, as it always did in moments of great stress, straight back to Michael, to the last conversation we'd had before he took his boat out that final time 11 years ago, laughing about some strange light he swore he'd seen out past the reef the week before, a story I had dismissed then as the kind of tall tale men tell each other over beers at the end of a long season. I remember standing at that broken hull with the sound of something's heartbeat rising up through the opening, and feeling for the first time in over a decade that my brother's disappearance and whatever we had found that night might be connected by a thread I was only just beginning to grasp. Wade wanted to call the Coast Guard immediately. I understood his instinct, and under any ordinary circumstance, I would have agreed with him without hesitation. But I stood there, with my hand pressed against the cold, strange metal of that hull, feeling the faint vibration of that heartbeat traveling up through my palm, and I told him we needed to look inside first, before anyone else arrived to take this decision out of our hands entirely. I did not fully understand my own reasoning in that moment. I only knew, with a certainty that surprised me, that I was not ready to hand this mystery over to strangers before I understood what it might mean for me, for my brother, and for everything I thought I knew about the ocean I had spent my whole life upon. We found tools in the hold of my boat capable of widening that jagged opening just enough for a man to fit through, and as the gray dawn light strengthened over the water, Wade and I set to work, neither of us speaking, both of us listening to that slow, steady heartbeat, pulsing patient and strange from somewhere within the wreckage, waiting, it seemed, for someone finally willing to come and answer it. It took nearly an hour of careful work to widen the opening enough for me to fit through, Wade holding a lantern steady at the edge while I used a pry bar to bend back curled metal that gave way more easily than I expected, almost as though the material itself had grown brittle with age, despite its strange, otherworldly appearance. I remember the smell that reached me first, before I ever saw anything inside, a scent unlike anything I had encountered in 3 decades on the water, something metallic and sweet at once, not unpleasant exactly, but entirely foreign, the way a hospital smells foreign to a man who has spent his whole life working outdoors. I lowered myself through the opening with the lantern Wade passed down to me, and the interior of that vessel revealed itself slowly as my eyes adjusted. A space perhaps 12 feet across. Curved walls lined with panels that glowed faintly with that same blue-green light we had seen pulsing from outside, though dimmer now, as if whatever powered them was running low on whatever fuel or energy source sustained it. Debris floated in shallow standing water across the floor, fragments of material I could not identify, and near the center of that chamber, held upright by some kind of framework I can only describe as resembling a chair, though built for a body I did not yet understand, I saw him. I use the word him deliberately, because whatever lay before me in that dim chamber possessed a shape close enough to human that my mind reached instinctively for that word, even as every detail resisted it. A form roughly the size and proportion of a man, though the limbs seemed slightly longer than they should be, the fingers extending one joint further than human hands allow, and the head, tilted forward against what might have been a restraining harness, held features that were unmistakably a face. 2 eyes closed beneath a smooth, pale brow, a nose reduced to little more than a suggestion, a mouth closed in what looked, absurdly, peacefully asleep. The skin, if skin is the right word, held a grayish undertone with a faint sheen to it, catching the lantern light the way wet stone catches sunlight. And across the chest, rising and falling with agonizing slowness, I could see clearly now the source of that heartbeat sound, a visible pulse beneath the surface, rhythmic and strained, the unmistakable evidence of a living creature clinging with tremendous effort to whatever life remained inside that battered, sinking vessel. I do not know how long I stood there, frozen, staring at a being that should not exist by any account of the universe I had been raised to believe in, feeling the lantern shake slightly in my grip, feeling my own heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, louder than the strange creature's own labored pulse. Wade called down to me from above, his voice tight with fear, asking what I saw, and I remember opening my mouth to answer and finding, for a long moment, that no words would come. "He's alive," I finally called back, and even as I said the words, I understood how impossible they sounded, how any reasonable man hearing them from a distance would assume drink or exhaustion or grief had finally broken something loose in my mind. But I said them again, steadier this time, because I needed Wade to understand what we had truly found, what decision we were now standing at the edge of, together, with nothing but our own judgment to guide us. "Wade, he's alive. We need to get him out of here, now, before whatever's keeping him going gives out entirely." Working together, careful not to cause further injury, we freed the being from the strange harness holding him upright, and I will admit, my hands shook the entire time, some ancient animal instinct in me screaming that I should not be touching this thing, this creature, this impossible visitor, while another part of me, quieter but insistent, told me this was exactly what I had been called out onto the water to do that night, exactly what fate or providence or simple chance had arranged for me to find. His body, when I finally lifted him free, weighed far less than I expected, light as a child despite his height, and his skin was cool to the touch, cooler than seemed survivable. Yet that faint pulse continued beneath my hands the entire time, patient and unyielding. We brought him up through the opening and laid him carefully across a tarp spread out on the deck of my boat, and it was there, in the strengthening light of true morning breaking finally through the last threads of fog, that his eyes opened for the first time, dark and depthless, fixing upon my face with an awareness that stopped my breath entirely. Wade stumbled backward with a cry, but I found myself unable to move, held in place by a gaze that felt, impossibly, familiar, as though I were looking into eyes I had known my whole life, though I could not for the life of me explain why that should be. And then, distant but unmistakable, cutting through the last of the morning mist, I saw them, lights in the sky far off toward the horizon, moving in patterns no aircraft I had ever witnessed could manage. And I understood, standing there on the deck of my boat, with a living impossibility, breathing beneath my hands, and lights gathering silently in the dawn sky above us, that whatever had happened out at Widow's Reef that night was only the very beginning of something far larger than either Wade or I had ever imagined ourselves capable of facing. We carried the being, still barely conscious, into the small boathouse behind my property before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, moving quickly and quietly, the way men move when they understand instinctively that whatever they are doing must not be seen by curious neighbors or early risers walking the shoreline with their dogs. Wade helped me lay him across an old canvas cot I kept for storing nets, and I remember how strange it felt to tuck a blanket around shoulders that were not quite human shoulders, to check a pulse that beat in a rhythm my fingers had never learned to count. Carol was awake by the time I came inside, standing at the kitchen window with her coffee gone cold in her hands, and I will never forget the look on her face when I told her, as plainly as I could manage, what Wade and I had found out past the reef that night. She did not call me a liar. She did not laugh. She simply set down her cup very carefully, the way a person sets something down when their hands have started to shake, and asked me to take her out to the boathouse so she could see for herself. 34 years of marriage teaches a man that his wife's judgment is often steadier than his own, and I was grateful, in that moment, for her calm. It was Carol who suggested we speak with old Ezra Thornton before doing anything else, and I confess I had not thought of him in years. Though the moment she said his name, I felt something settle into place, the way a key settles into a lock it was cut for. Ezra was 91 years old that year, the last of the old generation of fishermen who had worked these waters before the marina modernized, before GPS and depth sounders replaced instinct and memory. And he had a reputation, half affectionate and half mocking, as the keeper of every strange story our little harbor town had ever produced. We found him exactly where we expected, seated on the porch of the assisted living home overlooking the bay, a blanket across his knees, despite the mild morning, watching the water the way he always had, as though some part of him still expected to be called back, out onto it. When I told him what we had found, careful to leave out the more impossible details until I understood how he might react, his weathered face did not show the surprise I anticipated. Instead, something like relief passed across his features, the expression of a man who has waited a very long time to finally be believed. My father used to tell of lights beneath Widow's Reef, Ezra said, his voice thin but steady. Going back to his father before him, said there was something down there that didn't belong to God's ocean, something that took men sometimes, and gave nothing back except grief and empty boats. He looked at me then with an intensity that startled me, given his age and frailty, and asked whether the thing we found had a face. When I told him yes, he nodded slowly, as though confirming something he had suspected his entire life, but never dared to say aloud for fear of being thought mad. He told us stories that afternoon that I had never heard in all my years growing up along that coast, stories his father and grandfather had passed down about strange lights beneath the water, going back over 100 years, about fishermen who vanished near the reef only to have their boats found drifting empty days later, engines still running, no sign of struggle, no explanation anyone could ever offer that satisfied the families left behind. He spoke of a night in 1954 when 3 boats disappeared within the same week, and of an old woman named Agnes Pruitt, who claimed, until the day she died, that she had seen a man walk up out of the surf near the reef, looking exactly like her husband lost at sea 2 years before, though the man never spoke and vanished again before she could reach him. I felt something cold settle into my stomach as Ezra spoke, because the picture forming in my mind connected threads I had spent 11 years refusing to weave together. My brother Michael's disappearance had never been fully explained. His boat was found drifting near those same waters, engine idling, nets still in the water. No sign that anything violent or sudden had taken him. The Coast Guard report called it inconclusive, a phrase that had haunted me for over a decade, because it offered no comfort and no closure, only an absence where an explanation should have been. Wade sat quietly through most of this, his hand still bandaged from the rope burns, and I could see the weight of understanding settling over him the same way it settled over me. The terrible possibility that whatever creature now lay recovering in my boathouse might hold answers not just to some grand cosmic mystery, but to the very personal grief that had shaped the last 11 years of my life. When Ezra finally finished speaking, he reached out and took my hand in his own frail grip and told me something I have never forgotten. Whatever you found out there, Raymond, it did not come to you by accident. The sea does not work that way. It gives back what it owes, eventually, to those patient enough to wait for it. I left that porch with more questions than I had arrived with, and a growing certainty that the decision Wade and I had made out at the reef that night had set something in motion far larger than either of us had been prepared for. Something that reached back not just to old fishermen's tales, but to my own brother's final voyage, and something that was, even now, still unfolding above us in ways neither of us yet understood. By the second night, the strange visitor's condition had improved enough that his breathing had steadied into something closer to normal rhythm, though he remained mostly unresponsive, drifting in and out of what I can only describe as a deep, protective sleep. Carol had taken to sitting with him for stretches at a time, talking softly the way she used to talk to our children when they were small and frightened by thunder. And though I worried at first that this closeness might be unwise, I came to understand that her calm presence seemed to steady whatever fragile life force kept him tethered to consciousness. It was on that second night that I first noticed the boat trailing us. I had gone out briefly to check my crab traps near the mouth of the harbor, more from habit than necessity, and as I came back in through the channel markers, I caught sight of running lights holding steady at a distance behind me, matching my speed too precisely to be coincidence, staying just far enough back to remain unidentifiable in the dark. I cut my engine and drifted for several minutes, watching, and the trailing boat cut its own engine at almost the same moment, confirming what my gut had already told me. Someone was watching, and had been for some time. I said nothing to Carol that night, not wanting to add fear to a household already stretched thin with worry, but I began sleeping with my old service revolver within reach for the first time in years, and I found myself checking the boathouse windows obsessively, certain each time that I would find some stranger's face pressed against the glass. Wade came by the following morning, looking as though he hadn't slept at all, and when I told him about the boat, his already pale face went several shades paler. "My radio's been picking up strange transmissions," he said, sitting heavily at my kitchen table, refusing the coffee Carol offered him. Voices, but garbled, like they're coming from somewhere underwater, or from very far away. And numbers, Ray, sequences of numbers repeating over and over, like coordinates, though none I recognize matching anywhere near here. He pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his jacket pocket, numbers scrawled across it in his shaking handwriting, and though I could make no sense of them at the time, something about their precision, their deliberate rhythm, told me they were not random noise. That afternoon, a black sedan with government plates parked itself at the end of my driveway for nearly 2 hours, no one emerging from it, simply idling there in a way clearly meant to be noticed. A silent message that someone, somewhere, already knew far more about our situation than either Wade or I had told anyone beyond Carol and old Ezra Thornton. I stood at my window watching that car until it finally pulled away, and I felt, for the first time since pulling that impossible vessel from the water, genuine fear settle into my bones, Not fear of the being sleeping in my boathouse, but fear of what powerful forces beyond my understanding might be willing to do to protect whatever secret he represented. I drove out to see Ezra again that evening, needing the comfort of his certainty in a world that had grown increasingly uncertain by the hour, and I found him more agitated than I had seen him in years, gripping my arm with surprising strength as soon as I sat down beside him. "They came for others before, Raymond," he said, his voice dropping to barely a whisper, despite the empty porch around us. Men who found things out on that water and spoke too freely of what they'd seen. Some of them simply stopped fishing these waters altogether, moved inland, never spoke of it again. Others, he paused, and something haunted crossed his ancient face. Others were never heard from again at all. That night, lying awake beside Carol while the strange visitor rested in the boathouse behind our home, I found myself turning over every decision Wade and I had made since that fog-choked night at Widow's Reef, wondering whether we had, in our haste to understand, unknowingly opened a door that could never again be closed. I thought of Michael, of his own disappearance so many years before, and I began to wonder, with a dread I could not quite name, whether he too had stumbled upon something out on that water that powerful men had been determined, at any cost, to keep hidden from the world. The lights returned that night, distant over the water past the reef, moving in slow, deliberate patterns unlike any aircraft, and I stood at my bedroom window watching them for a long while, understanding now that they were not simply some passive phenomenon we had chanced upon, but something actively searching, patient and unhurried, for whatever had gone missing from beneath the waves. I did not sleep again until nearly dawn, and when I finally did, I dreamed of my brother's face, calling to me from somewhere far beneath the black water, telling me the truth was closer now than it had ever been, if only I was brave enough to keep reaching for it. On the fourth day, the being finally opened his eyes fully and remained conscious for more than a few passing moments, and it was Carol who was sitting beside him when it happened, calling for me in a voice tight with excitement and fear in equal measure. I came into the boathouse to find him sitting upright on the cot, unaided, his dark eyes tracking my movement across the room with an alertness that had been entirely absent in the days before. And though he said nothing, I felt again that strange, impossible sense of recognition passing between us, as though we had met somewhere long before that night at the reef. Communication, when it finally came, arrived not through spoken words, but through something closer to shared images, impressions that surfaced unbidden in my mind whenever I sat close to him and allowed myself to be still and quiet, the way you might allow yourself to receive a message carried on wind rather than through any language built from sound. I do not fully understand the mechanism even now, and I have given up trying to explain it in terms that satisfy the rational part of my mind. I only know that sitting beside him for long stretches, I began to see fragments, brief and disjointed, of a life and a journey I could never have imagined on my own. I saw vast distances, darkness stretching further than my mind could comfortably hold, and I understood, somehow, that he had traveled a length of time and space that made our entire ocean, our entire world, feel impossibly small by comparison. I saw the crushing violence of impact, the vessel he piloted striking something in its descent toward our planet, spinning out of control before finally settling, broken and sinking, into the waters off our coast decades before that night Wade and I found him. And I saw, with a jolt that stopped my breath entirely, a face I recognized instantly, despite the strangeness of the vision surrounding it. My brother Michael's face, younger than I remembered him, staring down in wonder at something beneath the waves. It took me 3 full days of careful, patient communication to piece together enough fragments to understand the shape of the truth he carried, and even now I hold pieces of it loosely, uncertain whether my human mind fully grasped everything he tried to convey. Michael had found him, or found evidence of his presence, years before that fateful final voyage, drawn by lights beneath the reef, the same way Wade and I had been drawn there ourselves. He had gone looking, alone, driven by the same curiosity and stubbornness that had defined him his entire life. And he had made contact of some kind, brief and incomplete, before disappearing entirely from the world I knew. I asked, in the only way I understood how, whether my brother was alive, whether he existed somewhere in whatever vast distance this being had traveled from, and the answer I received was neither the comfort nor the devastation I had braced myself for across 11 long years of uncertainty. Michael was gone, taken not by malice, but by an accident of circumstance, caught in some kind of protective response the failing vessel had triggered when threatened, a defense mechanism activated by proximity that neither Michael nor the pilot himself had ever intended. He had not suffered, or so I understood from the calm, sorrowful quality of the impression that reached me. He had simply, in an instant, ceased to be part of our world, drawn instead into whatever strange passage connected this vessel to wherever it had truly come from. I sat with that truth for a long while, Carol's hand tight in mine, tears running freely down both our faces, grief and relief tangled together in a way I had never expected grief to feel. 11 years of not knowing had been its own particular torment, a wound that never fully closed because it never had the chance to properly begin healing. Now, at last, I had an answer, however strange and impossible it might have sounded to anyone else in the world, and I found that even a terrible truth felt lighter to carry than the endless uncertainty that had preceded it. Wade, when I told him what I had learned, wept as hard as I had, having loved my brother as a friend since boyhood, and it was in that shared grief, strange and impossible as its source may have been, that I felt something in myself finally settle after over a decade of restless searching. But even as that particular wound began, at last, to close, I understood that a new and more urgent danger was closing in around us from every direction. The black sedans, the trailing boats, the strange lights gathering with increasing frequency over the water, and I knew that whatever peace I had found in finally understanding my brother's fate would be tested severely before this story reached whatever end awaited it. The storm rolled in on the 7th night without warning from the weather service, the kind of sudden violent squall that old fishermen like Ezra always claimed came from the sea itself deciding something needed settling, rather than from any pattern a satellite could predict. I remember standing at my window, watching black clouds swallow the last of the daylight in a matter of minutes, lightning forking down toward the water in jagged white cracks. And some old instinct in my chest told me this storm was not simply weather. It felt impossibly deliberate. It was during the height of that storm that the black sedans finally moved, 3 of them pulling into my driveway with headlights cutting hard through the driving rain, followed by a windowless van that parked directly across the boathouse entrance. Wade had been staying with us those last 2 nights, unwilling to leave Carol and me alone with what we were protecting, and it was his shout that alerted me to the men emerging from those vehicles, dressed in dark, tactical gear, entirely unsuited to a quiet fishing town, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this kind of work many times before. I will not claim I made every decision that followed with perfect clarity of mind, because fear has a way of narrowing a man's thoughts down to something close to instinct alone. I remember grabbing Carol and pulling her back from the window, remember Wade already moving toward the boathouse with a speed surprising for a man his age, and I remember the being, our visitor, standing on his own for the first time since we had pulled him from the wreckage, his dark eyes fixed on the approaching lights, with an expression I can only describe as calm, sorrowful resignation, as though he had expected this moment to arrive eventually and had simply been grateful for the days of peace that preceded it. The man who led the group identified himself only as Agent Colton, offering no additional credentials, no explanation beyond a flat assertion that what we were harboring constituted a matter of vital national security and that cooperation would go easier for all of us than resistance. I asked him plainly whether he intended to help this being or simply to take him away and study him like an object, rather than the thinking, feeling creature he so clearly was. And something flickered behind Colton's eyes, brief but unmistakable, that told me he did not entirely disagree with the discomfort behind my question, even if his orders left him no room to act upon it. It was Ezra Thornton, of all people, who arrived in the middle of that confrontation, driven out to my property against every protest from the staff at his assisted living home by a granddaughter I had never met, insisting she bring him the moment Carol had called to warn him what was unfolding. Frail as he was, soaked through by rain within moments of stepping from the car, he pushed his way past startled agents with a determination that silenced the yard for a long moment. And he stood before Colton with the kind of moral authority that comes only from having outlived nearly everyone who might have argued differently. "You people took men from these waters for 60 years and told their families nothing," Ezra said, his voice carrying clear and strong, despite his age, despite the storm raging around us. "You will not take this one the same way, not without every soul in this town knowing exactly what you did and why." I do not know whether it was his words alone, or the sight of a 91-year-old man standing unflinching in a driving storm, or simply the accumulated weight of everything that had happened over the preceding week. But something in Colton's posture shifted, and he lowered the radio he had been holding to his ear. What followed was not the violent confrontation I had braced myself for, but something quieter and stranger. A negotiation carried out in the pouring rain between grieving fishermen, a frightened government agent clearly following orders he did not fully believe in, and a being none of us fully understood, communicating through Carol, who had grown closest to him over those 7 days, impressions of peace and cooperation rather than fear. The being stepped forward on his own, placing one long-fingered hand against Colton's chest, and whatever passed between them in that silent moment caused the agent to step back, visibly shaken, and lower whatever weapon he had raised. By the time the storm broke just before dawn, an agreement had been reached that I still find difficult to fully believe even now. Months later, the being would go with Colton's team, but under terms none of us had expected to win, terms that included regular contact, permitted with myself and Carol, medical care overseen in part by doctors of our own choosing, and a formal acknowledgement, however quiet and unofficial, that what happened to my brother Michael, and so many others before him, would finally be recorded somewhere as truth rather than buried as inconvenient mystery. It was not everything I might have wished for, but it was, after 11 years of silence, more than I had ever dared to hope for. He left with them just after sunrise, the storm finally spent, the sky washed clean and pale gold in the way it only ever looks after a truly violent night has passed. I walked beside him to the van, Carol's hand tight in mine, and before he climbed inside, he turned back toward me one final time, and I felt, rather than heard, a last impression pass between us. Gratitude, sorrow, and something that felt remarkably like hope. The same complicated mixture I had carried in my own chest since the night Wade first called me out into the fog toward Widow's Reef. I did not know, standing in my driveway, watching that van pull away down the wet road, whether I would ever see him again, whether the promises made in the strange calm after that storm would truly be honored by men whose entire careers were built around secrecy rather than transparency. But I chose, in that moment, to believe them, because I had learned across that long, strange week that belief, however uncertain, was often the only thing standing between a man and complete despair, and I had already carried enough despair for one lifetime. The following months brought changes I could never have predicted. Ezra Thornton passed peacefully in his sleep 3 weeks later, and at his funeral, attended by nearly every fishing family along our stretch of coast, I understood finally the full weight of what he had carried silently for so many decades, the burden of knowing truths the world was not yet ready to hear, and the quiet dignity with which he had finally, at the very end of his life, seen at least a portion of that truth brought into the light. I think of him often now, out on the water, and I like to believe some part of him is still watching from wherever old fishermen go when their final voyage finally comes. Wade never fully recovered his old ease upon the water after that night, though he continued fishing until his health no longer allowed it, and the two of us grew closer in the years that followed than we had been even in our younger days, bound together by an experience neither of us could ever fully share with anyone who had not lived through it alongside us. We spoke of it rarely and always quietly, usually over coffee at his kitchen table on slow winter mornings, but the bond it created between us proved stronger than any friendship built purely on ordinary shared history. True to the strange agreement reached that stormy dawn, contact did come, sparse and carefully managed, letters at first, then eventually a single supervised visit nearly a year later, arranged with a discretion that told me powerful people were still working hard to keep our story contained. I will not pretend the visit answered every question Carol and I still carried, but it confirmed something I had chosen to believe since that final morning in my driveway, that he was, wherever he now resided, being treated with a measure of the dignity and care we had insisted upon during that tense negotiation, and that our small, stubborn act of decency had mattered. Carol and I visit Michael's memorial marker down at the Harbor Chapel every year on the anniversary of his disappearance, and for the first time in 11 years, this last visit felt different, lighter somehow, carrying grief that had finally found its proper shape, rather than grief twisted endlessly around unanswered questions. I stood there with her hand in mine, looking out over the water toward the distant line where Widow's Reef lay hidden beneath the waves, and I found myself, for the first time in over a decade, able to think of my brother without that old, hollow ache of not knowing pulling at my chest. I still take the Carol Ann out past that reef from time to time, alone usually, in the quiet early morning hours before other boats crowd the water, and I will admit that some part of me always watches the depths a little more closely than I once did, always listens a little harder to the particular silence that settles over that stretch of water, wondering whether the sea still holds other secrets, waiting patiently for the right person, at the right moment, to finally come looking for them. I do not know what the years ahead will bring, whether the promises made that stormy dawn will hold, whether I will ever again see those dark, familiar eyes that once looked up at me from a broken vessel resting on my boathouse cot. But I have learned, across this strangest chapter of my long life upon the water, that the ocean gives up its secrets on its own patient timeline, never rushed, never fully explained, only offered eventually to those willing to wait long enough and to look closely enough at the vast dark mystery stretching endlessly beneath every quiet, unremarkable wave.